Even though we've been removed from our homelands, we're still here.
As a result of previous land disputes, particularly between the rich southern landowners in Georgia and the Cherokees, the United States Congress passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830 after an extended debate, ultimately establishing the policy to relocate all Indian tribes west of the Mississippi River. Consequently, many Cherokees were expelled from their homeland in the Trail of Tears, and the Indian reservation system was popularized.
During the early 1800s, the Cherokees and Georgians had a strained yet relatively nonviolent relationship. The Georgians desired the Native Americans' land because it contained a surplus of valuable natural resources like gold and fertile farmland. The Cherokees had adopted a peaceful view of the colonists and believed that coexistence was possible, demonstrated through their attempts at partial assimilation into European culture. Nevertheless, they were loathed because of their dark skin and their refusal to support colonists in previous conflicts like the American Revolution. The Cherokees, however, believed themselves to have a good relationship with President Andrew Jackson, as Cherokee chief Junaluska saved his life during the War of 1812. Jackson allegedly announced,
"As long as the sun shines and the grass grows, there shall be friendship between us,"
thereby providing the Cherokees with a sense of mutual respect. As the years went on, however, tension over land rights grew between the Georgians and Cherokees. Andrew Jackson, who had promised peace between the two groups, went back on his word and began trying to eliminate the Indians from their native homes. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was
an act to provide for an exchange of lands with the Indians residing in any of the states or territories and for their removal west of the river Mississippi,
and was intensely debated both in Congress and throughout America. President Jackson declared that he would exchange the Indians' lands in the east for those in the west, and that the land upon which the Indians had previously resided would become the property of Georgia. He also ensured the American public that he would provide for all the Indians' needs for up to a year after their forced relocation, and would protect their land
against all interruption or disturbance from any other tribe or nation of Indians, or from any other person or persons.
There were a multitude of debates over the justification of the Indian Removal Act, as well as various internal struggles within the Cherokee Nation. Two key leaders of the Cherokee tribe, Chief John Ross and Major Ridge, both agreed that the tribe would be unable to defeat the Georgians if a violent struggle were to break out. Ross believed that the Cherokee should try to use the American legal system to validate their residency of the land, while Ridge asserted that complying with removal would result in the least long-term consequences for the tribe. Multiple prominent members of the Cherokee Nation shared Ridge's view, including Elias Boudinot, who exchanged various accusations with Ross as to who was really looking out for the good of the tribe. Ross's advocacy for diplomacy encompassed drafting several treaties and meeting with President Jackson on several occasions to discuss alternatives to removal. Ideally, Ross wanted Jackson to agree to
terms under which the tribe would give up a portion of its land to Georgia if, in return, the United States would guarantee the Indians their rights on the territory they retained.
When this offer was rejected, Ross explored the possibility of having the Cherokee Nation adhere to Georgian laws, eventually fully merging into the state. Jackson's administration rejected this proposal as well, though, making it clear that they would be satisfied only with removal, and that they were willing to pay $2.5 million for the land. Due to his failed diplomatic attempts, John Ross sued the state of Georgia on March 5, 1831. The ensuing case was taken all the way to the Supreme Court and became known as Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. Ross argued that since the Cherokee Nation and Georgia were separate entities, the court's duty was to prohibit the Caucasians from forcibly taking any more of its land. In the end, the court ruled in favor of Georgia, claiming that it had no legal standing to even hear the case, as the Cherokee Nation was considered to be domestic and dependent. The next year, in 1832, Christian missionary Samuel Worcester sued the state of Georgia for his unwarranted arrest. The case, later known as Worcester versus Georgia, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and quickly evolved into a trial of the Indians' rights as compared to the states. The court ruled that the Cherokee Nation is a distinct community in which the laws of Georgia can have no force, and which the citizens of Georgia have no right to enter. Nevertheless, President Jackson did not enforce the court's decision, allegedly crying,
"Chief Justice John Marshall has made his decision. Now let's see him enforce it."
The Supreme Court cases were
a great example of the inability of the legal system to deal particularly well with questions of race and racism.
They also exemplified the sharp divide of opinions even within the United States Caucasian community, and set the stage for future debate. Many American government officials believed that the Cherokee removal would be greatly beneficial not only to United States citizens, but also to the Cherokees themselves. Jackson's predecessor, President James Monroe, outlined the objectives of the Indian relocation as being
to prevent intrusions on the Indians' property and to teach them by regular instruction the arts of civilized life and make them a civilized people.
He also hoped that
the condition of all the tribes inhabiting that vast region may be essentially improved and permanent peace may be preserved with them.
President Jackson applied his own agenda and prejudices to Monroe's anti-Cherokee ideology. He had experienced several traumatic Indian attacks on his hometown during his youth, which fueled his hostility towards all Native Americans. Like Monroe, he felt that the Cherokee relocation would foster peace among the Indians and Caucasians, and that by distancing the Indians from civilization, he would eliminate their threat to the growth and modernization of American industry. Jackson also believed that the Indian Removal Act would cause the Native Americans
to cast off their savage habits and become an interesting, civilized, and Christian community.
When the initial relocation attempts met with hostility, he announced,
"Established in the midst of another and superior race, the Indians must necessarily yield to the force of circumstances and ere long disappear."
Nevertheless, many people argued that the Indian Removal Act was unjustified.
The tribes had the right to stay on the land.
Ralph Waldo Emerson, a transcendentalist essayist and philosopher, wrote a letter to President Martin Van Buren in 1838, expressing his disbelief at the man's intention to continue the Cherokee removal. He was appalled that the United States government was in the midst of making such a large-scale decision with neither the import nor the approval of the American people, writing,
"How could we call the conspiracy that should crush these poor Indians our government, or the land that was cursed by their parting and dying imprecations our country, any more?"
He went on to deem the Treaty of New Dakota, which dictated the terms of the Cherokee relocation, a
sham treaty,
as the supposed Indian representatives did not
represent the will of the nation.
The treaty was, in fact, just as Emerson portrayed it. The Cherokees had no part in its creation and were unable to voice their protests. Cherokee Chief John Ross futilely implored the Senate not to ratify the treaty. After they passed it anyway, he presented them with a petition that contained over 16,000 signatures, beseeching them to void the unjust treaty. His plea was unheeded. While most senators and House representatives agreed with Jackson's policy, Tennessee Congressman Davy Crockett furiously opposed it. He brought up the fact that the Treaty of New Dakota contradicted promises made in Article 5 of the 1785 Hopewell Treaty, which stated,
"If any citizen of the United States, or other person not being an Indian, shall attempt to settle on any of the lands westward or southward of the said boundary, which are hereby allotted to the Indians, then the Indians may punish him as they please."
Historical author O'Neill outlines Jackson's defense for discarding the treaty, stating,
Jackson firmly believed that the treaties that had been made could be ignored because they were made by the federal government in violation of the states' rights.
Despite the Cherokees' vehement protests and Crockett's valid arguments, the United States Senate ratified the Treaty of New Dakota in 1836. In disgust, Crockett resigned from his congressional position, leaving the Senate with his cry,
"You may all go to hell, and I will go to Texas."
2 years later, in 1838, President Van Buren initiated the Trail of Tears. Over 20,000 Cherokees embarked on this perilous journey. 4,000 of them died en route. The trail was riddled with obstacles, including impassable landforms, disease, freezing temperatures, scarcity of food, and brutality exhibited towards the Native Americans by the escort soldiers. One guard on the Trail of Tears remarked,
"I fought through the Civil War, and I saw men shot to pieces and slaughtered by the thousands, but the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work I ever knew."
The passing of the Indian Removal Act and the ratification of the Treaty of New Dakota also led to the popularization of the reservation system in the United States. Historian Judith Nyes even called the Cherokees' relocation a
forerunner
of the system. Initially, when Jackson proposed the idea of Indian reservations, he seemed to favor self-determination on the part of the Indians, appealing to the democratic ideals of the American public. Nevertheless, as time went on, Jackson began to impose a multitude of unjust laws upon them, thereby restricting both their liberty and their rights.
They put the Indians where no one else wanted to live.
The Indian Removal Act also led to the American Indian Movement, which was recognized in 1968 and gained momentum in the ensuing years. It was about the Native Americans
coming together and saying, we have civil rights too. But our civil rights are about our right to exist as a culture, as a people within our lands.
The Indian Removal Act is significant to both world and American history for a variety of reasons. Ironically,
within the history of America, we as a nation have done things to people that are the types of things that we look outward and condemn other nations for.
Everyone shouldn't be sitting around feeling sorry for it, but they should address the fact that it happened and take steps to make sure that something like this never happens again.
As American escort soldier John Burnett aptly pointed out,
"Murder is murder, and somebody must answer. Somebody must explain the streams of blood that flowed in the Indian country in the summer of 1838. Let the historian of a future day tell this sad story with its sighs, its tears, and dying groans. Let the great judge of all the earth weigh our actions."